So, the image that broke this whole thing wide open wasn't a leaked legal document, a whispered rumor from a disgruntled courtier, or a carefully curated palace press release designed to manage the narrative. It was an empty chair, a single, highly conspicuous empty chair at a lavish state reception that screamed louder and echoed further than any official statement ever could, simply because Queen Camilla, the woman who had fought for decades to secure her place beside the monarch, was not sitting in it. The devastating reason she was entirely absent from this grand public spectacle was that she had just walked out of a highly classified, private council meeting where she was officially, formally, and very quietly erased from the royal line of continuity, a move so calculated and absolute that it completely redefined the future of the monarchy. She was not divorced, she was not stripped of her current royal title, and she was not banished from the physical premises of the palace, but she was separated from the crown's future so thoroughly and completely that every single ounce of influence, every charitable network, and every ounce of soft power she had spent decades meticulously cultivating would essentially evaporate into thin air the exact moment King Charles's reign eventually comes to an end. The wildest and most heartbreaking part of this entire constitutional earthquake is that King Charles knew this irreversible decree was coming, having agonized over it for days, before she even walked into the room to hear her fate. Before we get into the exact timeline, the secret meetings, the hidden alliances, and the handwritten notes that led to this unprecedented royal rupture, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any updates on this story as it develops. Now, to truly understand the gravity of this situation, we have to look closely at what actually happened inside that heavily guarded room when the Royal Household Council, which is essentially the behind-closed-doors group of the most senior officials, legal advisors, and top-tier royals who handle urgent, existential institutional matters, had gathered to settle a dispute that had been quietly and dangerously brewing in the shadows for weeks. They were there to confirm, on paper and for the historical record, that Camilla would no longer hold any place whatsoever in the monarchy's future line of institutional continuity, using polite palace language to mask a brutally sharp blade. Let me break down what that specific terminology actually means for her daily life and her legacy. She absolutely stays queen during Charles's reign, retaining the prestigious title, the demanding daily duties, the highly visible public role, the patronages, and all the ceremonial respect that comes with being the king's consort. However, she permanently loses any succession-related authority, any potential role in a hypothetical emergency regency, and every single institutional protection that might have carried her influence beyond her husband's lifetime, meaning her power is strictly tethered to his mortality. This executive order didn't end her marriage or physically remove her crown, but it did something far colder and more systematic. It dictated that absolutely no power linked to her current position could ever be passed down to her children, her extended relatives, her loyal household advisors, or her personal charitable foundation. Her years of grueling public work and image rehabilitation would remain visible in the history books, but absolutely none of it would become a permanent fixture in the operational machinery of the crown. So, as the Lord Chamberlain finishes reading this devastating multi-page document aloud in the suffocating silence of the council chamber, Camilla does not explode in anger, she does not argue the legalities, she does not demand a broader explanation from the officials, and most tellingly, she does not turn to Charles to beg for his ultimate sovereign protection. Instead, with a chillingly composed demeanor, she pushes back her heavy oak chair, calmly removes the official palace briefing folder from her lap, places it squarely on the table, and walks out while stunned, breathless courtiers watch her exit in absolute, pin-drop silence. In that fleeting, heavy moment, right before she crosses the threshold, she turns to Charles and waits for just a single beat, expecting the man she has loved for decades to challenge the ruling, to reject the document, to say her name, to offer some semblance of resistance, or to do something, anything, to defend her legacy. He doesn't do any of that. Instead, he simply lowers his eyes to the crisp papers neatly arranged in front of him, and that impossibly small, defeated movement tells her what no one in the room had dared to say out loud. He already knew, and he had known long before she ever entered the room to be ambushed. Camilla closes the folder with incredibly careful, deliberate hands and says, with a voice devoid of shouting, but heavy with finality, "You have already decided who I am," a line that lands with so much more destructive force than a screaming match ever could, slicing through the regal atmosphere of the room. She rises completely before the king can even attempt to formulate an answer, and walks toward the grand double doors with her profound humiliation held securely behind a rigid, aristocratic calm that she had spent years perfecting for the cameras. And here is the specific detail that tells you absolutely everything you need to know about the other major player in the room. Prince William never moves a single muscle. He doesn't look overtly victorious, he doesn't smirk, but he certainly doesn't look shocked or sympathetic either. His absolute stillness suggests deep, strategic preparation, and Charles acutely notices this chilling lack of surprise. As the heavy doors securely shut behind his retreating wife, sealing her fate, the Lord Chamberlain discreetly covers a second, highly confidential sealed page with one hand, a hidden document that officially names the specific royals who will immediately inherit every single long-term responsibility and privilege Camilla has just formally lost. Charles finally lifts his heavy gaze, looks directly at his eldest son, and asks a question that breaks the room. How long have you been preparing this? That singular question is the ultimate fracture point of this entire saga, revealing that behind the polished palace announcement stand three people bound together by a complex web of love, duty, trauma, and memories that absolutely none of them can ever erase, and tragically, all three of them genuinely believe they are valiantly defending the monarchy. Camilla views the committee's decision as the calculated destruction of absolutely everything she spent decades trying to build, legitimize, and secure against a public that once despised her. Charles sees the brutal ruling as a necessary but agonizing punishment he ultimately failed to prevent because he was paralyzed by the weight of the crown. William sees something entirely different from both of them, a vital, unyielding protective wall built securely around the future of the crown, meant to shield his own impending reign from outside interference. The tragic reality is that only one of them has the ultimate power to determine what the monarchy actually becomes when the dust settles, and that is where this entire narrative becomes incredibly complicated and deeply human. Camilla had spent the better part of 2 decades painstakingly turning mere survival into genuine, operational influence, building that influence meticulously through a vast network of charities, strategic household appointments, flawless execution of ceremonial duties, and her constant, undeniable access to the ear of the king. Those roles mattered immensely to her because they provided her with far more than just elevated social status. They gave her a lasting, structural place inside the ancient royal system, establishing a network of loyal people and long-term commitments that were actively supposed to carry her influence forward into the next generation. The newly signed order threatened to instantly reduce every single hard-won achievement to a mere temporary privilege, something politely accepted and tolerated strictly during Charles's reign, but aggressively denied any permanent, structural place in the crown's future architecture. And that is a uniquely brutal distinction when you really think about the psychology behind it. She could do all the exhausting work, smile endlessly through the tedious events, support the king through his darkest hours, and build her charitable legacy from the ground up, but none of it would stick beyond her husband's final breath. It is the equivalent of being explicitly told that your entire life's work, your redemption arc, and your career have a strict expiration date that is inextricably tied to the heartbeat of someone else, rendering your own individual legacy entirely disposable. William, on the other hand, carried an entirely different, equally heavy burden as the direct heir, the person who is undeniably first in line to inherit the throne and all its accompanying crises. He had started ruthlessly examining every single palace promise, contract, and appointment through the unforgiving question of what would actually survive after his father passed away. He deeply feared that private, informal arrangements linked to Camilla, her specific household staff, or her extended, non-royal family members could stealthily become permanent, unshakable obligations for his own future reign, creating a shadow court he could not control. To the Prince of Wales, the decision to cut her from the continuity line wasn't born out of petty, historical revenge for his late mother. It was a cold, calculated, and necessary clean break, designed specifically to protect Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis from inherited agreements and financial obligations they had absolutely never approved of. And truthfully, that is actually a very reasonable, pragmatic constitutional concern when you step back from the emotional family drama and look at it through the lens of a future head of state. If informal privileges, vague advisory roles, and expansive charitable networks are simply allowed to continue automatically from one reign to the next without a hard reset, You are essentially inheriting someone else's entrenched power structure without ever officially consenting to it, which is a recipe for institutional disaster. William wanted to guarantee that his highly anticipated reign started with a clean slate, driven by his own sovereign choices, his own trusted staff, and his own modern vision, not weighed down by obligations fundamentally baked into the system by his stepmother's ambitious private office. Charles remained completely alone in the echoing council chamber, long after the other officials and his son had departed, placing one trembling hand on the empty wooden chair beside him, and feeling the crushing, suffocating weight of what had just transpired under his watch. The king genuinely loves his wife, a fact that absolutely nobody in the royal orbit seriously disputes anymore. But as a monarch, he also inherently knows that his heir's strategic fears cannot simply be dismissed or overridden without catastrophic consequences. Ignoring William's demands and siding entirely with Camilla might have instantly created an unprecedented constitutional battle between the currently reigning monarch and the future one, sparking a conflict powerful and bitter enough to irreparably divide the family and destabilize the institution long before the succession even began. So, Charles found himself impossibly stuck between his deep instinct to protect the woman he loves and his absolute sovereign duty to preserve a stable, unified transition to his son, realizing with quiet horror that those two vital objectives had somehow become completely mutually exclusive. Meanwhile, Camilla sat isolated in her private sitting room, with the unsigned, devastating briefing papers resting on the table before her. She slowly removed a priceless royal brooch from her dress and placed it deliberately beside the file, her mind racing through the betrayal. She was undoubtedly furious with William's cold calculation, but she knew the deeper, more profound wound belonged entirely to Charles, because he had cowardly allowed her to walk into that council room completely without warning, knowing full well she would hear the life-altering decision broadcasted in front of a room full of staring staff members. That isn't just a high-level policy disagreement or a constitutional maneuver. That is a husband letting his wife be publicly ambushed and humiliated because he lacked the courage to face her wrath in private. While Camilla sat in the quiet ruin of her future, William was already several steps ahead, meticulously reviewing the confidential draft of the new palace structure again, noting that several high-profile duties and patronages were already explicitly marked for immediate transfer to Catherine, the Princess of Wales, proving the changes were far larger, more systematic, and more deeply planned than Camilla had initially realized. It was then that Charles discovered a private, handwritten note buried in his files, showing he had actually fought desperately behind the scenes to soften William's original, much harsher proposal, trying to at least preserve her ceremonial dignity. But Camilla answered his weak defense with a single, devastating handwritten message delivered to his office. "Come without your aids!" Tell me whose decision this truly was. The inevitable, explosive confrontation between husband and wife was finally coming, but its true underlying cause began with one buried, seemingly innocuous moment 6 weeks earlier that absolutely no one in the inner circle had forgotten. The entire decision to rewrite the royal future didn't start with a dramatic legal document or a formal parliamentary vote. It started quietly inside a private Windsor meeting, where one specific sentence proposed by Camilla transformed William's long-standing suspicion into open, aggressive resistance. Camilla had entered that meeting fully expecting quick, rubber-stamp approval for what she deemed a harmless, practical administrative arrangement, while William left that exact same meeting entirely convinced that the future crown was being quietly, systematically surrounded by loyalists who did not answer to him. Charles had desperately attempted to calm them both down and find a middle ground, but the psychological damage had already been irreversibly done. From that defining moment forward, every silence between them became evidence of a plot, every signature became a perceived threat, and any lingering familial trust vanished completely. Here is what Camilla had actually, specifically proposed that set the entire palace machinery on fire. She wanted to formally create a continuity role for her team, which was basically designed to grant temporary, consultative access intended to keep her palace work, her charities, and her staff stable when one reign eventually ended and another officially began. Her core argument was logical on paper. She insisted that her private office could seamlessly guide charities, manage staff transitions, and handle ceremonial commitments during the historically difficult, emotionally charged period between Charles's inevitable passing and William's full, official assumption of total sovereign control. To her, This proposal was a necessary safety net, a layer of protection against institutional confusion and operational chaos during a time of profound national mourning. But to William, reading the fine print, it looked exactly like an unauthorized shadow authority aggressively trying to survive past its rightful constitutional limit. When William reached the specific supporting clause in her proposal, he read it twice in disbelief. The provision legally allowed selected, senior advisors from Camilla's private charitable foundation to continue actively working from royal premises, utilizing royal resources, for a full 12 months after the king's reign ended. So, William looked directly at his father and asked, with a voice that stayed remarkably controlled, but dripped with unmistakable, future king anger, why people chosen exclusively by his stepmother should have any right to remain entrenched inside the palace walls after he became the reigning monarch. Charles immediately jumped to defend his wife, insisting passionately that her years of relentless public service, her endurance of media scrutiny, and her loyalty had earned her a basic level of security, respect, and a highly dignified transition out of power. He reminded his son that Camilla had stood beside him through decades of intense criticism and had dutifully carried out unglamorous engagements that others in the family had flatly refused to touch. William didn't deny her historical contribution or her work ethic. He simply answered, with devastating constitutional logic, that personal dignity was not the same thing as inherited authority, making the monarch suddenly and painfully understand that his marriage and his succession were pulling the crown in completely opposite directions. Camilla, sensing the tide turning against her, slid the draft document directly toward William and stated firmly that the crown does not simply begin again just because the throne changes hands, implying her work must be respected. William coolly closed the document, pushed it firmly back across the table, and replied, "Under me, it must." That icy exchange became the absolute point of no return for the Prince of Wales, prompting him to quietly but aggressively commission a highly confidential audit, a private, rigorous review designed specifically to identify, isolate, and catalog every single informal privilege, financial tie, and advisory role that might attempt to continue beyond Charles's reign without the next sovereign's explicit approval. And this is exactly where Princess Anne enters the story in a massive, game-changing way, quietly joining the high-level discussions and warning William in a documented, highly classified private memorandum that blurred lines of power could create dangerous rival loyalties, deeply weakening the authority of the incoming monarch. Her crucial, unwavering support gave William the ultimate institutional credibility he desperately needed to execute this purge, because Princess Anne's reputation is basically unimpeachable when it comes to duty, discipline, and protecting the crown above all personal feelings. Palace officials and Charles himself couldn't simply dismiss the sweeping review as William's personal, lingering childhood resentment, when the highly respected Princess Royal was actively backing it with formal, written constitutional advice. Camilla unfortunately discovered the painful truth of this alliance just 3 days before the disastrous emergency meeting, when she accidentally found the words, Operation Clearline, printed inside a misfiled household scheduling dossier, instantly understanding that William had moved aggressively from passive resistance to full-scale, institutional action. By the time she furiously summoned Charles to speak with her completely alone, the argument was no longer about one specific clause in a transition document. It was a fundamental battle about whether he had actively protected his wife or cowardly surrendered her entire future to appease his son. Charles entered Camilla's sitting room without a single equerry, bodyguard, or private advisor to shield him, finding her standing rigidly beside the fireplace with the damning palace document open in both of her hands. For several agonizing seconds, neither of them spoke a word, the silence heavier than any argument, until she finally asked him point-blank whether he had known about the plot to erase her. The king hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that tiny, agonizing hesitation answered absolutely everything she needed to know. What followed wasn't a polite constitutional discussion between a sovereign and his consort, but a brutal, emotionally raw confrontation between a husband who had fatally compromised and a wife who believed the very man she had defended against the world had allowed the crown to completely erase her existence. Charles shamefully admitted that he had formally received the final recommendation from the council 48 hours earlier. The formal, binding advice sent to the sovereign before a major structural decision, setting out exactly what the top palace officials believed must happen next to secure the institution. He pleaded that he had spent those 2 sleepless days desperately trying to soften the harsh legal language, attempting to protect Camilla's ceremonial position, and trying to stop the executive order from becoming a complete, humiliating exclusion of her legacy. The king frantically insisted that he had fought for her behind closed doors, but all she heard was that he had ultimately failed her in silence, allowing the machinery to roll over her. Camilla rejected his weak distinction immediately, stating fiercely that remaining physically beside Charles at grand ceremonies meant absolutely nothing if every single part of her actual authority, influence, and protection disappeared the exact moment his reign ended. The queen firmly believed that the palace, and by extension Charles, wanted her grueling service without guaranteeing her future, demanded her loyalty without offering protection, and expected her public smile without providing any lasting place for the people, charities, or causes she had built around herself. She stepped aggressively closer, pressing the thick document directly against Charles's chest, and told him, "You let them erase me while asking me to keep smiling beside you." A statement so painfully true that Charles gripped the folder but couldn't formulate an answer at once. Then, stripping away the royal facade, the king confessed what had truly frightened him the most. He admitted that outright rejecting the council's recommendation might have pushed William completely out of the transition planning process, halting the vital, private work that prepares the heir to assume full control when the throne eventually changes hands. He confessed that he had chosen institutional unity with his son because a broken, hostile succession could irreparably damage the monarchy itself, admitting he knew that choice would deeply wound Camilla, but he had made it anyway for the sake of the crown. Camilla demanded to know whether William himself had personally written the final, devastating clause. Charles said no, but his pained face betrayed the deeper, harsher truth. The prince had aggressively insisted on its central, unyielding principle, that absolutely nothing linked to her private network would automatically survive into his reign. The king then revealed the final, crushing piece of pressure through a documented conversation, recorded in his private briefing notes. Anne had warned him directly that allowing 2 rival centers of loyalty to exist could tear the family apart during a vulnerable succession, and the Princess Royal's stark words had finally convinced him the review could no longer be stopped. Hearing this, Camilla quietly removed the small, priceless crown-shaped pin Charles had personally given her right after their coronation, placed it deliberately beside his hand on the table, and flatly informed him that she would not attend the highly publicized evening state reception, a devastating boycott. Charles looked at the discarded pin, then at his fiercely proud wife, and promised to confront William personally, not to reverse the decision, because he knew that was impossible, but to discover exactly how far the aggressive restructuring of the palace had already gone. The king left her in complete silence and walked directly through the winding corridors toward the heir, who was already systematically redrawing the entire palace structure around a future reign that had not yet begun. William didn't receive his father in a grand, intimidating chamber. He waited calmly in a small, utilitarian palace office, with only 2 specific folders and a handwritten list resting on the desk, a visual simplicity that unsettled Charles far more than any grand ceremony would have, because this wasn't a rebellion performed for an audience. It was a completed, airtight strategy. The prince had already ruthlessly examined royal appointments, grace and favor residences, charitable foundations, advisory privileges, and private access lists, meaning Camilla's removal from the royal line of continuity wasn't the entire decision at all. It was merely the first, most visible consequence of a massive institutional purge. William fundamentally understood the strict limits of his present constitutional power. As merely the heir, he knew he couldn't rewrite Charles's current reign. He couldn't remove the queen from her present, daily duties, and he couldn't command the monarch's active household staff. But succession planning, the highly confidential, private work of preparing for the next reign, gave him an entirely different, incredibly potent kind of authority, allowing him to outright refuse to inherit informal commitments and to aggressively separate temporary permissions from the core responsibilities that the future crown would be legally expected to continue. Princess Anne had significantly strengthened that exact position, firmly believing that continuity should solely protect the monarchy itself, not preserve the personal networks, friends, or favorites cultivated around one specific royal figure. Her documented, highly respected advice easily persuaded nervous, career-minded officials that William's campaign wasn't simply a petty, emotional attack on his stepmother, but a necessary disciplined boundary that was far harder for Charles to dismiss as mere family drama. Charles looked at his resolute son and asked the haunting question that had followed him from his wife's sitting room. Was this massive purge truly about constitutional clarity, or was it simply old, deep-seated anger wearing the respectable language of duty? William's jaw visibly tightened as the king spoke the exact fear neither man had ever wanted named out loud. The tragic past had never truly disappeared. It had merely learned to sit quietly and patiently inside every single conversation they ever had about the future. William flatly refused to apologize, stating with absolute conviction that he would not allow George, Charlotte, and Louis to inherit a palace deeply divided by promises they had never made, ensuring his children would not begin their public lives trapped inside complex arrangements, created before they were even old enough to understand them. Charles heard absolutely no cruelty or malice in his son's voice, which made the finality of the situation even more frightening, because William was operating entirely on cold, institutional logic. Catherine, however, had already questioned the severe human cost of this maneuver. Before the meeting, the Princess of Wales had gently asked William whether protecting the crown truly required publicly humiliating Camilla in front of the entire household staff. He had paused before answering her, still firmly believing the decision was constitutionally right, but she had forced him to silently admit that the orchestrated walkout had become something far harsher and more vindictive than the policy itself required. William then opened the second folder on his desk, revealing the sealed page that explicitly named Catherine and Anne as the joint, immediate recipients of all of Camilla's stripped transition responsibilities, with final, absolute authority resting entirely with the reigning monarch or the direct heir. Charles read the document once, then read it again, realizing that one vital power still remained entirely his. The sweeping restructuring couldn't take full, legal effect until the king himself physically signed the implementation order, the specific document that turned William's blueprint into binding palace action. William had decisively won the intellectual and constitutional argument, but Charles still controlled the pen, forcing the monarch to carry the heavy order back to his private office, where Camilla's empty, haunting chair waited across the room, symbolizing the choice he had to make. The palace had chosen its secure future on paper, but now Charles had to decide whether he could actually sign the cold decision that had just shattered the trust in his marriage. The implementation order remained completely unsigned on his desk for nearly 3 agonizing hours, with Charles sitting entirely alone, the fountain pen uncapped beside his hand, staring across the room at the chair Camilla normally occupied during their intimate evening briefings. No senior advisor dared to enter, no telephone rang to interrupt the silence. The king had been given absolute privacy, but in that moment, the isolation felt exactly like abandonment. When he finally reached out his hand to grasp the pen, he knew with sickening certainty that he wasn't simply choosing between right and wrong. He was actively choosing which fundamental relationship the ancient monarchy could survive without. Meanwhile, Camilla's bustling office remained completely, awkwardly frozen while the document waited. Until Charles officially signed the order, her loyal staff couldn't approve any long-term appointments, continuity agreements, or structural commitments designed to remain active beyond his current reign. Those operational restrictions mattered immensely because every minute the signature was delayed left the entire palace suspended dangerously between 2 conflicting systems, the fading authority of the current queen and the ironclad boundaries William intended to brutally enforce as the future sovereign. Palace secretaries, sensing the shift in power, began reorganizing quietly and efficiently, removing sensitive transition files directly from Camilla's office and transferring them into a highly secure cabinet shared exclusively by William, Catherine, and Anne. These transition files are the critical, private records used to prepare duties, allocate staff, and manage authority for the complex change from one monarch to the next. So moving them meant the queen was already being systematically separated from the future, even before the ink on the order made that separation official. Up in his office, Charles finally lowered the gold pen and wrote his name excruciatingly slowly, pausing heavily over the final letter, before placing the pen down beside the now binding order, completely understanding that his signature protected the long-term succession from competing claims, but also knowing it confirmed Camilla's deepest, darkest fear. When forced to choose, he had placed the crown's survival above hers. Camilla returned to her office briefly to collect her personal papers, opened the continuity cabinet, and found it completely empty, prompting a nervous courtier to explain that the files had been moved under strict royal instruction. The queen thanked him calmly, waited until he scurried out, and then gripped the edge of her heavy desk, steadying herself against a harsh reality she could no longer deny. Sticking to her word, she sent an official message that she would absolutely not accompany Charles to the highly anticipated evening reception. A calculated absence that forced the palace PR machine to choose between admitting to a massive family conflict or offering a blatantly harmless, transparent explanation. Either choice carried immense danger. Silence would instantly invite wild media suspicion, while honesty could expose a catastrophic family fracture to the public before the new power order had even settled. When panicked officials offered Catherine the opportunity to take Camilla's vacant place beside the king to project unity, the Princess of Wales flatly refused, stating wisely that the transition must not appear to the public to be one woman's vicious victory over another. She would accept the future responsibilities on paper, but she would not turn her stepmother's humiliation into a public celebration. That was a remarkably telling, brilliant moment, because Catherine understood something that often gets completely lost in these brutal royal power struggles. The visual public perception matters just as much, if not more, than the legal paperwork. She had eagerly stepped into that highly visible seat. It would have looked to the world like she was aggressively dancing on Camilla's grave, and that kind of ruthless imagery sticks forever. Instead, she smartly stepped back, and Princess Anne stepped forward. The Princess Royal attended the reception beside her brother, offering unshakable stability without appearing to maliciously replace his wife, though Charles painfully noticed the cameras and the guests' attention constantly fixed on the glaringly empty space where Camilla should have stood, and Anne understood immediately that the silence of that absence spoke louder than any palace statement ever could. Late that night, after the reception ended in whispers, Camilla sent William a highly private, unexpected request. She wanted to meet him the following morning completely alone, without Charles, without Catherine, without Anne, and without a single palace staff member present. The king's signature had made the devastating decision official, and now, the queen fully intended to face the very man who had made her exclusion unavoidable. Camilla was already waiting with perfect posture when William entered the small morning room. No briefing folders stood between them, no advisors lurked behind the doors to take notes, and no king was present to soften what either of them might unleash. For the very first time since this existential crisis began, the queen and the heir faced each other not as rival, warring offices, but as two distinct people fundamentally shaped by the exact same family, and tragically divided by the exact same history. She didn't waste time asking him to reverse the order because she knew it was done. Instead, she asked him directly why he genuinely believed such a brutal purge was necessary. Camilla strategically abandoned the legal argument first, telling William that she completely understood his constitutional right to reject any commitments extending into his own reign. But what she couldn't accept was the insulting suggestion that her grueling years beside Charles had created absolutely no legitimate place in royal history. The queen reminded him that she had endured unprecedented public hostility, carried heavy duties during incredibly difficult years, and supported the king relentlessly when the monarchy desperately needed stability. To simply erase her future influence was one thing, but to make her service appear entirely temporary, conditional, and disposable was a humiliation she would not accept. William answered her carefully, stripping away the anger. The prince explained that the order fundamentally didn't remove her marriage, her title, her public work, or her rightful position beside Charles, but rather, it strictly created a necessary boundary around the next reign. He emphasized that this boundary mattered deeply, because no private household, family advisor, or charitable network should ever inherit access automatically when the crown passed to a new, entirely different sovereign. He insisted he was strictly protecting the office of the monarch, not trying to maliciously rewrite her past. Camilla heard the constitutional distinction, but the deeper, personal wound remained raw. She told William that she had lived for years, fully knowing he would never completely trust her, but the walkout hadn't happened just because of one legal clause. It happened because Charles had remained completely silent, while that deep distrust became official palace policy. In that shattering moment, she revealed she believed even her husband had ultimately decided that institutional suspicion mattered far more than her personal loyalty. William didn't attempt to defend the cruelty of the process, openly admitting that the explosive announcement should never have been delivered to her in a room full of staff without prior warning. The prince still fiercely supported the core decision, but he accepted that necessary constitutional clarity had been poorly handled and turned into unnecessary personal humiliation. His unexpected honesty profoundly changed the atmosphere in the room. Camilla had braced for cold resistance, but instead, she heard a future king taking responsibility for the human cost of his actions. Then, The queen offered a compromise that absolutely no one in the palace had predicted. She proposed that she would voluntarily dissolve the disputed continuity office herself and publicly surrender every single post-reign privilege connected to her family. But in return, the palace must record the decision permanently as a voluntary act of selfless service rather than a forced expulsion. That was a truly remarkable, masterful pivot. She was accepting the exact same outcome, losing all her future influence, but brilliantly reframing the narrative so it was her noble choice rather than her humiliating punishment. William, recognizing the wisdom in this graceful exit, agreed immediately to amend the public declaration. It would formally and highly praise Camilla's immense work throughout Charles's reign, while concurrently confirming that her operational authority ended the second his sovereignty began, ensuring her historical legacy would remain intact, but her influence would definitively not become hereditary. Camilla calmly slid the original, hostile order across the table, and William respectfully placed the newly amended page beside it. After a long, heavy silence that felt like the closing of an era, she picked up the pen and signed the voluntary renunciation with a steady hand. The prince told her the revised, respectful declaration would be announced to the global press that afternoon, and Camilla looked at him, her dignity restored, and answered, "This time I will not walk away." Their secret agreement completely transformed the trajectory of the crisis, but the world had already seen the queen leave, in apparent disgrace, meaning the palace PR team now had to rapidly explain to a frantic public why she had chosen to return. By sunrise, the dramatic story of Camilla's walkout had completely escaped the impenetrable palace walls, dominating the global news cycle. Broadcasters endlessly replayed the shaky footage of the moment her car sped away from Buckingham Palace, without Charles in the back seat. Newspaper editors scrambled to prepare massive special editions. Royal commentators engaged in vicious on-air arguments over the true meaning of the decree, and massive crowds gathered anxiously behind the steel barriers outside the towering gates. Yet, despite the chaos, the most powerful and defining image of the entire saga was still to come. Mere hours after appearing publicly defeated and exiled, the queen confidently returned to the exact same palace entrance. But this time, she arrived beside William, visibly carrying the amended declaration she had signed herself. The palace had lost control of the initial story almost immediately, as breaking news alerts described an unprecedented, historic rupture between the queen and the succession, meaning the direct, sacred order through which the crown passes from one monarch to the next was under threat. Some frantic broadcasters presented Camilla as the tragic victim of a cold, calculated institutional purge masterminded by a ruthless heir, while others passionately argued that William had simply and righteously protected his future reign from unelected, private influence. Every single version of the rapidly spreading story carried the exact same underlying message. The royal family's private, bitter conflict had once again become a massive, uncontrollable national spectacle. Charles, meanwhile, remained completely out of sight, having cancelled a high-profile private audience to stay hidden inside the depths of Buckingham Palace, while wild speculation spread far beyond the original, contained decision. His glaring absence mattered deeply, because the public no longer saw only a dry constitutional dispute over transition files. They saw a husband who had not followed his wife out the door, and a marriage that might have completely fractured beneath the crushing, unforgiving weight of the crown. Surprisingly, Camilla suddenly received a massive wave of sympathy from the very people who had harshly questioned her motives for years. The stark, lonely image of her leaving the reception alone stripped away the usual, protective control of royal ceremony and revealed something painfully, undeniably human to the public. Viewers saw deep humiliation, stark isolation, and a woman brutally forced to absorb public rejection without the basic protection of the men beside whom she had loyally served. Consequently, William quickly became the target of growing public anger, with commentators fiercely accusing the prince of treating his father's elderly wife with calculated, unnecessary cruelty just to flex his future power. Catherine, astutely watching the rapidly shifting coverage beside her husband, warned him that maintaining their stoic silence would inevitably allow the country to mistake his constitutional caution for petty, personal revenge, knowing that the future king could easily protect the crown on paper and still completely lose the public's vital trust. Then the devastating evening edition appeared on the newsstands, with the headline, "The Queen Who Walked Away," stretched across the front page. And beneath that bold text sat one single, devastating photograph: Camilla's empty, haunting chair at the state reception, That single, powerful absence perfectly captured the entire nation's growing fear that something fundamental and permanent had broken inside the institution. Hundreds more gathered outside Buckingham Palace as the tension peaked, until a broadcaster suddenly announced the breaking news that Camilla had surprisingly returned to the grounds. The massive crowd fell completely quiet as she stepped gracefully from the car, remarkably standing beside William rather than Charles, projecting a united front that confused the narrative. The Queen held the amended declaration tightly and spoke to the assembled press with a highly controlled, regal finality, stating clearly, "I have voluntarily surrendered every authority extending beyond the King's reign. Service to the Crown must never become ownership of its future." William remained stoically beside her, publicly accepting both the lingering criticism for his actions and the peace of the final settlement. Then, the massive palace doors slowly opened, and Charles finally appeared alone, waiting under the archway for Camilla to walk toward him. The public declaration had successfully ended the constitutional conflict on paper, but only their physical reunion in front of the cameras could reveal whether the severe personal damage could still be survived. Charles didn't rush to approach Camilla immediately. He remained rooted beneath the palace arch as she crossed the vast courtyard, the signed, historic renunciation held firmly against her side, while William respectfully stopped several steps behind her, allowing the husband and wife to face the massive consequences of the last 48 hours, completely alone. The Queen had permanently lost her claim to any lasting place within the future machinery of the crown, and the King had permanently lost the comforting illusion that his love could protect her from the ruthless demands of the succession. Yet, crucially, neither had lost the final choice of whether this brutal moment would destroy them or redefine their partnership for the remainder of his reign. Camilla's institutional position was now completely unmistakable to the world. She would absolutely remain queen throughout Charles's reign, proudly continue her vast ceremonial duties, and passionately lead the charities she had spent years building. But the final, signed settlement, the formal, binding agreement defining exactly what would survive beyond the current reign, drew a hard, impenetrable boundary, ensuring that no office, no advisor, no privilege, and absolutely no authority connected to her would transfer automatically when William eventually became king. William had successfully secured the future line around Catherine, George, and the direct succession, with Princess Anne firmly supporting the crown whenever institutional stability demanded it. The prince hadn't maliciously removed Camilla from the present. He had simply, surgically prevented her private household, her children, and her personal network from gaining any inherited, unearned influence inside his future reign. Charles finally stepped forward toward his wife, and instead of defending the harsh decision or hiding behind the grand excuse of royal duty, he quietly admitted to her that he should have warned her before the council meeting, confessing that allowing her to hear the judgment in front of others had been deeply cowardly on his part, even if the constitutional boundary itself had ultimately been necessary for the monarchy's survival. Camilla listened carefully without interrupting him. The Queen then told Charles that she could forgive the institutional decision far more easily than she could forgive his silence when she needed him most. She didn't reach into her pocket to take back the crown-shaped pin she had removed during their confrontation, knowing that specific symbol belonged to the blind trust they had permanently lost, but she did reach out for his hand, agreeing to enter the palace beside him and face the future together. William, in the end, gave her something far more lasting and meaningful than a private apology. The final, official palace record stated clearly for history that Camilla had voluntarily placed the undisputed, secure succession of the crown far above the protection of her own future influence. That specific, carefully chosen wording permanently transformed her exclusion from a humiliating public rejection into a final, undeniable act of selfless royal service that would be respected for generations. When Camilla finally returned to her usual, prominent chair at the very next family council meeting, absolutely no continuity files waited before her on the table. The glaringly empty space in front of her made the new, strict boundary perfectly clear to everyone in the room. Presence was not power, and maintaining dignity did not require total control. William entered the room shortly after, met her eyes across the long table, and gave a restrained, respectful nod, which the Queen calmly returned. Charles officially opened the meeting, while Catherine and Anne sat quietly holding the thick transition documents that had once belonged to Camilla's office, signaling the dawn of a new era. The verdict was final, absolute, and unchangeable. Camilla had forever lost her place in the monarchy's future structure, but through sheer grace, she had flawlessly preserved her place in its present story. William successfully protected the long-term succession of the ancient institution without forcing his father to completely abandon his beloved wife in her final years. Charles painfully learned that love couldn't simply erase constitutional limits. It could only help the people trapped inside the system survive them. The heavy palace doors had violently closed behind Camilla in utter humiliation days prior, but when they finally opened again, she returned on completely different, self-authored terms, not as the entitled owner of the crown's future, but as a deeply devoted queen who had actively chosen its survival over her own power.